Yeah, the truth. Oh, it's a dog store. Yeah, I'm not most of them use it.
7th July, 1918. Dear Aunt, I sent my boys down to bathe the other day. When the sergeant came back, he poked his head into my dugout and said, "Lieutenant Rule, there's something you should know. The place is lousy with guns of all sizes back on the river, and tanks are hidden all over the shop." Well, this is the first I knew of anything being in the wind. Still, whenever we see tanks, we begin to put two and two together. Our boys are pretty quick at sizing things up, and they'd seen too many of those preliminary preparations to be fooled. So the cat was out of the bag, and we had to make the best of it. In the afternoon, a bunch of Yanks came up to be distributed among us for the fight. This was the first time that the Americans had been in the line, and they were dead eager. It bucked our lads up wonderfully. All the novelty of war had long since vanished for our boys. They'd seen too many shows like this, and as a rule, before such a fight one sees only set, grim faces. But on this occasion, everyone was smiling and laughing. They were on their mettle, and were determined to let the Yanks see what the Aussies were capable of.
The battle took place at dawn on the 4th of July 1918. The place, a little village in France called Hamel. This battle was truly important. It showed a way in which the deadlock which had held Europe in the grip of an unwinnable war could be broken. A veteran Australian force with a brilliant commander, backed up by some untried American infantry and British tanks, aircraft and artillery, pioneered tactics which showed how the Great War could be won, so that the horror could end.
It's Anzac Day, 3/4 of a century after that battle. I'm John Laffan. I've been a soldier and now I'm a military historian. For nearly 40 years I've studied the battlefields of the Western Front, here in France and in Belgium. But I'm always drawn back to this cemetery for the war dead on the ridge above the battlefield of Hamel. Whenever I come to Villers-Bretonneux Memorial, I study the names on the wall because I know a number of these names. I know the families to whom these names mean so much. It's a very nostalgic place, an emotional place, and I can always be sure that something's going to happen to stir my emotions yet again.
The Great War wasn't supposed to happen, but the world's leaders called each other's bluff once too often. They had built up huge armed forces to threaten their neighbours. These mighty forces were supposed to guarantee security and preserve the fragile peace. Instead, a series of events got out of hand, and the sheer mass of these forces pushed Europe into its worst war ever. These Australians were keen to prove themselves in this great adventure. The government pledged support for Mother England to the last man and the last shilling. Volunteers poured in recruiting booths. Only the best were taken in these early days.
The diggers were worried that it would all be over by Christmas and that they'd have no chance to prove themselves to Mother England and to their own people. A few generals, such as Lord Kitchener, warned that it might not be so simple.
It wasn't. It was a war of outdated tactics versus state-of-the-art technology. It was a fearful war.
We had left lecture room, classroom and workbench behind us. We had been welded by a few weeks' training into one corporate mass, inspired by the enthusiasm of one thought: to carry forward German ideals. The war had entered us like wine. We set out in a rain of flowers to seek the death of heroes for the sake of our fatherland.
The men were brave enough. Over and over again, the French and British charged the German line, nearly always to be repulsed. The Germans, with equal courage, charged the British and French artillery and machine guns with the same results. There was little give and take. Convoys prepared to sail to the other side of the world. Some 314,000 men of the Australian Imperial Force, the AIF, would go before it was over. Almost 180,000 would die or be wounded before the AIF returned. They were all volunteers. They were paid well, better than the conscripts in the British or French forces. They were paid 6 shillings a day, and they called themselves the 6 bob a day tourists.
An important piece of news. Our letters are to be censored. In one way, it's rather agreeable to feel the air of military discipline around me, but I do draw the line at these letters being read by others than my friends. But I suppose there is a risk now.
The Australians were seen by the British commanders as second-rate soldiers who despised the spit and polish of a real army and were always too eager to brawl.
The English military manner, or reserve, somewhat clashes with the free, broad-minded and independent spirit of our Australians. Yes, I think we're certainly distinctive.
Year in, year out, in the choking dust of summer and the sinking mud of winter, the two sides tried to break through, to get behind the other and cut off his lines of supply. Neither side could manage it. Behind the lines, the cities, the factories, railways and roads stayed open, feeding ammunition, guns, food, supplies into the front line. Modern transport and weapons were on the side of whomsoever was defending. Courage was not enough. Reinforcements could always be moved up to the front faster than the attackers could advance across no man's land. But neither side was willing to give in. Each was convinced it could win.
You see, dear father, now I am like you. I have none of that claptrap, so-called patriotism. But nevertheless, I am full of pity and sympathy for the sufferings of our dear German nation. And so I shall not separate myself from my own people, neither in thought nor in heart, despite the horrors.
The Australians were shipped into this meat grinder.
The digger hat wasn't the only distinctive headgear on the Western Front. The helmet of the French poilu, this is one of them, was equally distinctive. The diggers got on much better with the informal French than they did with the English.
The French were in overall command of the Allies, although Britain maintained an independent command of her own troops and the troops of her dominions.
General Haig had taken over as commander not only of the British armies but all those of the Empire as well, and as such he was in command of the AIF, the Australian Imperial Force. And General Haig was very superior indeed. Few Australians ever had the opportunity to speak to him, but his strategy, tactics and outlook affected them profoundly. Haig was a cavalryman who thought the machine gun a much overrated weapon. He was obsessed with offensive action. When he failed time and again to break through, he resorted to wearing down tactics. Unfortunately, these tactics wore down his own armies faster than they wore down the Germans. Haig never really understood the Australians, whether they were soldiers, NCOs, officers or senior commanders. He was irritated by their confidence and annoyed by their independent spirit. He disapproved of the way the Australian officers and men mixed with each other and shared their lives.
When I eventually reached my own men at battalion headquarters, I found them damp, cold, miserable, peevish and hungry. The portion of the town allocated to our cooks was deserted, and where they had settled down was for me to find out. In an out-of-the-way lane I heard voices coming from the earth. Here were my two cooks seated with a couple of demi-johns of rum, singing lustily to the tune of the church's one foundation.
We are the Anzac Army, the ANZAC. We cannot shoot, we can't salute, what bloody good are we? And when we get to Berlin, the Kaiser he will say, Hoch, hoch, mein Gott, what a bloody odd lot to get 6 bob a day.
Haig launched his great Somme offensive with a brand new volunteer army from England to reinforce his command. The new men were brave enough but undertrained and over-trusting of their commanders. 60,000 casualties on the first day, 20,000 of them killed in action, 420,000 before the offensive ground to a halt in a stalemate. Meanwhile, the French had 315,000 casualties at Verdun. Each army had its share of butchers and bunglers in command.
Weather appalling and nightly raids by German aircraft. My theatre tents are blown into rags and tatters. More convoys of wounded are coming in. Are we winning the war?
Ammunition columns bring up fodder for the insatiable jaws of the guns. We meet parties of wounded, each with a white label attached to his second buttonhole. They are out of it now. They won't have to go up the line again. So, in spite of their sufferings, they jog along quite merrily.
To a civilian and to a new soldier, the sight of dead men is very unpleasant. But to an old hand, it has a strange fascination. I wonder who he was. I wonder if his mother knows. I wonder what joys and sorrows he had on earth, what terrors he endured before he went west.
A fresh east wind is blowing, which not only prevents all risk of gas attack, but is good for the harvest.
They were a company of physical wrecks, all of them, exhausted by fatigue, trembling and feverish through lack of sleep. 6 days without a wash and a shave, bodies masses of eruption caused by vermin, and eyes shining with unnatural brightness in the faces made worn and cadaverous by the horrors of that awful environment.
They were too far away to take their leave in Australia, so they saw London and Paris. The wounded were treated in hospitals in England and France, and when they recovered, they went back to their mates at the front, where they were wounded again, or qualified for leave again, or died. Now there were far fewer Australians volunteering to join them. By now, there was scarcely a family in Australia who had not lost a father, a son, a brother, an uncle, or a nephew. The AIF was seriously under-strength and overstretched. The idea of compulsory service was proposed. Australia's Prime Minister Billy Hughes proposed conscription twice, and twice the voters refused it in referendum. Australia was split by the issue, and the vote was very close. The diggers voting in France were the ones who tipped the scale. As far as they were concerned, this was still a war for volunteers.
These young men were more mature. They'd grown up from the eager boys of 1914 and 15, those who'd been to Gallipoli. They'd been through a lot. They'd been through not only a baptism of fire, but whole 3 years of fire. And they developed into responsible, thinking soldiers, highly professional. But beyond that, they were very proud of being Australian. They carried their identity with great pride, with great feeling, and indeed with great emotion. They were proud of being diggers. They relished that word. They were proud of their mateship. Mateship was everything in the AIF. And they wore this badge, this Rising Sun badge, with a great deal of distinction and a great feeling of honor. Nobody forced them into the war. They went of their own free will. They stayed here of their own free will. They fought for their mates. They fought for their country. They fought for their people at home, whom some of them hadn't seen for years.
In December 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution overturned the rule of the Russian Tsar. The revolutionaries wanted no part of an imperial war and signed an armistice with Germany. Now, Germany would no longer have to divide its forces between East and West. Now, huge numbers of men and guns were released to concentrate on the Western Front. The Allies were in a poor state to hold off the Germans. The French army had been on the defensive since mid-1917. The British army remained stalled at Flanders after a series of appallingly costly attempts to break through the German lines. However, the Allies had kept up a strong naval blockade, and Germany was running short of food and raw materials. And across the Atlantic, the USA had entered the war.
A new and almost unlimited source of manpower was thus opened up to the Allies. But the American armies were far away, organizing, training, trickling across the Atlantic Ocean at only a few thousand per convoy. In the deadly interval between the collapse of Russia and the first effective manifestations of American power, the German army struck.
General Haig had ignored the warning signs, and the Allies were caught badly off guard as the Germans smashed down on them. The French civilians were fleeing once again as yet another battle was being fought across their farmlands. They watched as Australians were rushed to the front to fill the gaps left as the Allied armies poured back to Paris in a panic-stricken retreat. The French countryfolk liked the easy-going Australians. Les Australiens, they said, vous les tirandrez, you will hold them back. the British Fifth Army, which included the Australians, lost 150,000 men and 1,000 guns before the Germans began to slow down. The Australians were fortunate. They came up against the Germans as their offensive had almost run out of steam. They stopped them just short of Amiens, at the small village of Villers-Bretonneux. It was the 3rd anniversary of the Anzac landing. Haig recovered his composure and met with the Allied commanders-in-chief to plan another offensive. With them was the newly arrived American commander-in-chief, General Pershing. General Pershing had agreed that the best way for his troops to be brought up to battle standard was to farm out the American divisions to the more experienced French and British troops. But no way were they to be used piecemeal to plug gaps in the Allied lines. They would only fight when they were trained and ready, and then under American command.
In these relatively quiet conditions, the High Command encouraged the Australian divisions to carry out raids and minor attacks to collect information and harass the enemy.
We generally made bastards of ourselves. Each of us supplied our share of the raiders. Under cover of a barrage, they would hop in, grab a few prisoners, kill all the others they laid their hands on, and get out in 15.
German morale in the sector plummeted. It was this private war that really created the digger legend among friend and foe.
Now, Haig appointed this man to take over the Australian Corps, the finest fighting force on the Western Front. John Monash was nearly 50, a citizen soldier rather than a regular, a civil engineer by profession. Unlike Haig, he was not a relic of the 19th century cavalry school. He was an artillery officer who fully understood the implications of 20th century technology. He was highly intelligent, well-educated, and superbly organized.
The true role of the infantry was not to expend itself upon heroic physical effort, not to wither away under merciless machine gun fire, not to impale itself on hostile bayonets, but on the contrary, to advance under the maximum possible protection of the maximum possible array of mechanical resources in the form of guns, machine guns, tanks, mortars and airplanes.
Monash wasted no time in trying out his ideas.
There had been no Allied offensive of any appreciable size on any of our fronts since the close of the Passchendaele fighting in the autumn of 1917. I sought for a promising enterprise to test our offensive power, designed not merely to capture prisoners and machine guns, but to hold on to the ground itself.
Monash pointed out that the enemy facing the Australians in this sector of the Somme were of low quality and their defenses were poor. Monash proposed an attack on the fortified village of Hamel. He approached Sir Henry Rawlinson, his British superior. Rawlinson agreed readily.
It was high time that some commanders on our side of no man's land should begin to think offensively and cease to look over their shoulders to estimate how far it was to the English Channel.
Every farmer in and around Hamel has his collection of shell cases dredged up from his field at every ploughing. The French army calls regularly to destroy those shells still alive after 75 years. Hamel is a little village just 17 kilometers from Amiens, where Ludendorff's offensive ground to a halt against the Australians. It's northeast of Villers-Bretonneux, where the War Memorial now stands. Hamel has been rebuilt since those dramatic days when the Germans had occupied it. The village and the surrounding woods were on a ridge, which gave the Germans excellent observation of the Australian positions in front and the French out to their left. I'm standing on the extreme left flank of the Australian line immediately before the Battle of Hamel, marked by the line of trees along the famous River Somme, and extending across these wheat fields on which so much of the fighting took place, up the ridge, along the road in the distance, another 3 kilometers, and then beyond that ridge itself to the Roman road which links Villers-Bretonneux and Peronne. There were 3 objectives to be taken. Hamel village, which had been fortified, the trenches between Hamel and Vaillé woods, and a pear-shaped strongpoint which would allow the Germans to fire along the line of any attacker.
But to capture Hamel, it would need a full division, 20% of the remaining Australian corps. Some senior staff officers felt the risk too great. It was not worth crippling the effectiveness of such a fine force for such a minor objective. Rawlinson and Monash were about to agree, reluctantly, when a solution arrived from an unexpected quarter. A succession of supply trains arrived on that very day at a railway siding just down the main road to Amiens. On board was the brand new 13th Tank Battalion, fresh from the factories of England. There were the fast Whippet Scout tanks, but best of all, there were these monsters of the latest type, Mark V tanks, faster, better armed, more maneuverable than those which had not performed well in earlier campaigns. These would give the Australians a truly modern force and reduce casualties. Use them now, urged their commander, before the Germans begin to receive supplies of tanks from their factories and the advantage was lost. Monash recalled Churchill's reasons for developing these armoured vehicles as devices to cut through the forests of barbed wire that protected each trench line.
If artillery is used to cut through the wire, the direction and imminence of the attack is proclaimed days beforehand. But by this method, the assault follows the wire cutting almost immediately. That is, before any reinforcements can be brought up by the enemy, or any special defensive measures taken.
During the Battle of Bullecourt in April 1917, the British tanks let the diggers down, and they swore they'd never again have anything to do with them. So when General Monash wanted to use tanks for the Battle of Hamel, they took some persuading.
It was not an easy problem to restore to the Australian soldier his lost confidence, or to teach him that the tanks, appropriately utilized, were destined to exert a paramount influence upon the course of the war. I directed that the tanks keep open house. The infantry were taken over the field for joyrides, were allowed to clamber all over the monsters, inside and out, and even helped to drive them and put them through their paces. The digger took the tank to his heart, and each tank was given a pet name and battalion insignia. The fame of the tanks and all the wonderful things they could do spread rapidly through the Corps.
The 4th, 6th and 11th Australian Infantry Brigades were assigned to capture Hamel. Monash knew that he would be seriously low on manpower. He decided to spread his attacking Australians thinly across the front, but make up the difference with firepower. There would be plenty of light and medium machine guns to boost the infantry. There would be the mobile guns aboard the 60 tanks. There would be aircraft to bomb and strafe as well as to act as aerial observers. Ammunition would be dropped to advancing troops by parachute for the first time in the history of warfare, an invention by Captain Wackett of 3 Squadron Australian Flying Corps. 4 carrier tanks would also resupply the front line, armoured freighters which would save hundreds of men the dangerous task of carrying forward ammunition, trenching equipment, food and water by hand. And there would be a formidable amount of artillery. Monash told Rawlinson that the attack depended on it. For the fortnight before the attack, the Australian artillery threw a light, harassing mix of gas, smoke and high explosive at Hamel in the early hours of each morning at about the time of the planned attack. The Germans became used to it.
We were often shelled at night. I lay on my bunk on a mattress of fresh grass and listened with a quite peculiar and ungrounded sense of security to the shells falling. I felt a war weariness occasioned by too many years of the war's excitement.
Occasionally, the huge howitzers of the Fourth Army would send over a shell into the wire and plough up craters. These were carefully plotted on the battle maps as they would provide valuable shelter on the morning of the attack.
General Monash and his staff depended upon expert maps to make their plans for the battle. And expert they really were, because they were made by field survey companies who were relying partly on aerial observation and aerial photography, partly on the work of infantry patrols. So that this map, which was used by the 13th Battalion at the battle and drawn late in June, only a few weeks before the battle itself, shows the barbed wire, the enemy wire. The barrage maps for the field artillery and the heavy guns show just how meticulous was the planning, with time frames, ranges and areas of responsibility in great detail.
Monash preferred to plan by confidence. He started with the higher commanders to establish the general outline of the plan, and then progressively included the lower officers as the details were discussed.
Questions were invited, difficulties were cleared up, and conflicting views of the different services on matters of technical detail were ventilated. The battle plan having been thus crystallized, no subsequent alterations were permissible under any circumstances, no matter how tempting. This fixity of plan engendered a confidence throughout the whole command and stopped the vicious habit of postponing action until the last possible moment, lest counter-orders should necessitate alternative action.
The preparation, he wrote to Rawlinson, would take 7 days from the time when the operation was authorized, probably early July. In the meantime, the infantry trained with the tanks and preparations were kept as secret as possible.
I received your nice letter of July the 1st. It flowed over me like a golden stream of beauty. All quiet. Our men come out of their dugouts, wash themselves, stretch themselves.
Dear Ma and Pa, mail has not been received for a couple of weeks. All quiet here.
For some weeks, the 33rd American National Guard Division had been training in the Fourth Army area, and its regiments had been distributed for training and trench experience to the Australian Corps. I applied to Fourth Army headquarters and received approval to employ in this battle a contingent of about 2,000 of these men.
To the Commander, 33rd American Division, the commanding officer of the 4th British Army, General Rawlinson, has requested that certain small units of your division be permitted to take part in a raid of some kind.
The American Commander-in-Chief Pershing had no idea of the extent of this raid planned by Monash, which was totally contrary to his agreement with the Allies. He had welcomed their offer to train his troops, but unless there was a major emergency, such as Ludendorff's breakthrough, he remained adamant that U.S. troops would go into battle only under U.S. command. These U.S. troops would be under Australian command.
One of my boys asked a Yank, "Are you going to win the war for us?" "Well," came the quick and tactful answer, "we hope we'll fight as well as you."
With 2 days to go, the troops, the supplies, the guns and the ammunition had all moved up under the cover of darkness. Diversions and dummy raids were ready to go in other parts of the front line. The tanks were parked in orchards 3 miles down the road and well out of sight. Monash held a final conference before the battle. It lasted for 4 hours. 250 officers attended from all units, and there were 133 items on the agenda. Nothing was left to chance.
When the last day before the attack arrived, we took our boys into our confidence and explained everything that it was necessary for them to know.
The American troops were excited, but nervous.
A vital part of the plan was that the troops should lie low all day, and some difficulty was found in getting these inexperienced boys of ours to realize the need. A German battery began to shell the area and quickly brought about the desired stillness.
This was just routine. The Germans suspected nothing out of the ordinary.
All over the empty expanse were hidden eyes fixed on our little wood. All around, distributed in trenches, shell holes, caverns and ruins, were men and guns awaiting their turn in a battle for a piece of ground covered with splintered trunks. Far behind, at opposite poles, I knew there were 2 generals seated at tables spread with maps.
On the eve of battle, the 3rd of July 1918, disaster befell the Americans. Not the disaster of arms, but of a command decision. General Pershing found out and demanded that the 6 U.S. companies, if not the whole 10, were to be withdrawn at once. The distress of the 6 was so evident that they received sympathy from all sides. Eventually, because it was too late in the day to recall those already at the start line, the remaining 4, about 1,000 men, were allowed to go forward with the Australians. At 6 p.m. on the 3rd of July, warning telegrams reached the AIF units and those American troops remaining with them. The start time for battle was to be 3:10 a.m., the 4th of July. Some Australian commanders had given their troops a hot supper, a novel and thoughtful gesture before action which very much impressed the Americans. The night was still, exceptionally still and quiet, and one veteran Australian commander, Ray McSharry, commented on the way in which the troops, just like shadows, flitted to their spaces on the white start line, ready for the action.
The fixing of the exact time for the opening of a battle has always been the subject of much controversy. The Australians always favoured the break of day, as this gave them the protection of the hours of darkness for the assembly, but sufficient light to see one's way.
At 3:10 - 8, we climbed out of the support line and started off for the front, just as the guns began to rumble. We had run into barbed wire which held us up, and before we knew where we were, down came our barrage with the most terrifying crash I have ever heard. All we could do was keep going steadily forward.
Now the suspense was over and the attack began in earnest as the barrage from the 600 guns replaced the harassing fire. Were moving forward, but the noise of their motors was drowned by the roar of the artillery and the racket of the huge hand-propelled bombers which were flying up and down the enemy line. The barrage moved forward according to the carefully planned timings, with the diggers and the tanks keeping as close to it as safety from their own shells would allow.
The next 100 yards were the worst. If we could get safely over that, we would be pretty right.
In general, the creeping barrage was accurate. accuracy could hardly be universal, with artillery being forced to rely so largely on map reading and stopwatches for its ranges. One Australian and another US section were virtually wiped out when some guns fired short. Elsewhere, the inexperience and over-enthusiasm of the Americans led some of them to rush into the barrage. At least one Australian, Corporal Roach, died as he ran ahead to stop them. 4 minutes had elapsed since 0 hour. There was a dense haze of smokescreen and dust mixed with a ground mist. Both tanks and infantry made their way through it skillfully, guided by men with compasses. The Germans were still underground, thinking it was just another trench raid. Within minutes of crossing the start line, 1 battalion of Australians had reached the wire at Pear Trench.
The troops were left without tank support, unusual because the tanks elsewhere had got to their targets. So the infantry did what infantry always do. They went in and did the job themselves. But the trench was protected by double bands of barbed wire, machine guns, and machine guns firing overhead as well from positions higher up. So the Australians were momentarily blocked. As the troops moved up, one young Lewis gunner, a Queenslander from Atherton called Harry Dalziel, pulled out his revolver and rushed one of the machine gun nests. He shot 2 of the Germans manning it and captured the rest. More infantry rushed in, and Pear Trench was taken.
The barrage moved forward.
We kept on advancing, and when we arrived close to their lines, the Huns came running from their positions with their hands over their heads, calling, "Kamerad! Kamerad! We surrender."
The second obstacles were Wehr and Hamel woods. The tanks were catching up with the advanced infantry, but it was still not light enough to shoot and maneuver with accuracy. It was still an infantryman's fight. Lance Corporal Axford launched himself at a machine gun nest in Kidney Trench. He threw hand grenades among the gunners, leapt into the trench, killed 10, captured 6, and threw the offending machine gun out onto the parapet. "Come on," he yelled to his platoon, which it did.
I'm marking the spot where my mate has fallen wounded. The Australians at Hamel were very worried that if they fell into the long, deep wheat fields through which they were crossing to make their attack, tanks following them might well crush them to death. It was a very real fear. So the idea was conceived that the soldier's own rifle would be used by one of his mates to mark his place of falling. This would tell the tank commander to steer clear. It would also attract the stretcher bearers to the spot where the wounded man could be taken out.
The third objective was Hamel itself. A great many tanks had been allocated to clearing this target.
The Australians had to fight for this little town, street by street, building by building, cellar by cellar, and in every case against strong enemy opposition.
In about 20 minutes of our bombs falling among them, they began to come out and give themselves up, 1 or 2 at a time. What a harvest for our boys. Talk about a ratting. As each Hun advanced with his hands above his head, several of our lads would dive at him, and before the astonished Hun knew what had happened, hands were in every pocket and he was fleeced of everything but his name and his clothes.
Behind the protective barrage, the Australians and Americans dug in. It was the first time that US forces had fought an offensive battle, and they were exultant of their success. There had been fewer than 1,000 casualties on the Allied side, not many more than 100 killed. Monash had ordered that once the objectives were taken, the troops were to occupy the captured trenches or dig new ones in anticipation of a counterattack. He did not want his troops overextended and exposed, and he was determined to hold the ground that he had captured. Capture, consolidate, exploit. Winning was one thing, holding was another. The carrier tanks rolled up. Never had ammunition and supplies reached the forward attackers with such speed and profusion.
Only 3 tanks of the 60 engaged were knocked out, although some went astray in the mist.
Each hour of every day at our hospital, one was touched by tragedy. The convoys come in and greet me with, "Sister, we've got another Australian for you."
In the gathering light, observation aircraft from 3 Squadron Australian Flying Corps flew low over the Australian and American forward line. The aircraft tooted their klaxon horns. In the shelter of each trench and dugout, the Australians lit up their flares. These pinpoints of light gave the aerial observers a clear picture of where the Australians were situated. These were noted on maps, which were dropped to Monash at his headquarters.
No battle within my previous experience passed off so smoothly, so exactly to timetable, and so free from any kind of hitch. I planned for 90 minutes. It was all over in 93. It was the perfection of teamwork. It attained all its objectives.
In spite of our counterattacks, the enemy still held a firm footing on our front line and in the strongly barricaded communication trenches.
More real good was done by this small operation with the Australians than could have been accomplished in months of training behind the lines.
Next day, we were relieved and got clear without a shell coming near us. Once again, life was worth living.
On the 27th of July, we were relieved by a company of the 164th Infantry Regiment. We were indeed utterly exhausted.
The main item of social news appeared to be that 4 ladies of easy virtue had come on a visit and would be at home to their friends and allies. The ladies handed out refreshments for all they were worth until some brass hats bundled them out of town.
The victory at Hamel caused immense public jubilation in Paris. Georges Clemenceau, the Prime Minister of France, the old tiger as he was known, had dragged his war-weary nation this far in the belief that no peace was possible with Germany, not even a tolerable peace, until that nation had been utterly defeated. On the news of Hamel, Clemenceau cancelled his regular weekly visit to his own battered troops on their part of the front, and instead went to the Western Front, the Australian part, to visit Monash and his Australians. General McLagan took up the cry from one of the diggers, "3 cheers for France!"
August 11th, 1918. General Pershing, along with General Bell, who commanded the 33rd, waited to meet King George V of Great Britain. News of the success of US troops at Hamel had caused mixed emotions in Pershing, given that his men had participated in direct contravention of his agreement with the British. The King had come on one of his regular trips across the English Channel to the battlefield, this time to the US headquarters at Moulins-au-Bois to present medals to the victorious Americans in person. This grand gesture went some way towards soothing General Pershing. Pershing, in his turn, awarded medals to his troops, including the American Congressional Medal of Honor. And soon enough, the Americans would be in the thick of it again.
There were other awards too. Lance Corporal Thomas Axford and Private Harry Dalziel, both of whom had been badly wounded that day at Hamel, each received the Victoria Cross. That awarded to Harry Dalziel was believed to be the 1000th Victoria Cross award since the institution of the decoration in 1854. But John Monash was the victor of Hamel. King George V also visited the Australians and knighted their chief, who had seen the opportunities where so many other British commanders had failed to do so. If Hamel seemed a little like overkill in the considerable weight of materiel used in a relatively small battle, it must be remembered that for 4 long years there had been little reward for a strategy of offence. To attack was to die. The German defences had been too strong. What happened at Hamel was that Monash's tactics gave the Allied army a method suitable for attacking any enemy position, no matter how wide its front or how complex its defence system.
A month later, the tactics were employed on a much larger scale. On the 8th of August, the Australians and the Canadians, starting from Hamel, punched a gigantic hole in the German front. Ludendorff referred to this day as Der Schwarze Tag, the Black Day of the German Army.
After Hamel, I heard that I had been recommended for a decoration. But I'd had that experience before. Being recommended and getting an MC were two very different things.
He did receive it, became a captain, lived through to the armistice on November the 11th, 1918, and watched peace break out.
I spied 2 Anzacs coming up the walk, so I waited for them, and then we went to Mrs. Pengilly's and had tea together. Goodbye. I must stop this letter now, with ever so much love.
The battalion was coming home by instalments, never to assemble again. The AIF was slowly dissolving and becoming a mere memory. The grand fellows we had known and loved, some of them were only memories too, but, well, for all the dreadful implications of war, which the soldier barely realises when he's in the thick of it, there is something to have known men as they truly are.